11,000 hours of embroidery, 600 hours of handcrafting, and even gowns completed inside an auto body shop. Everything sounds like pure dedication to fashion as art. At the Met Gala, where the theme turns every outfit into an open canvas, celebrities are given one clear mission: be unforgettable. Yet in a night built on creativity and excess, not every bold vision lands the way it was intended. In this video, we revisit the most debated fashion moments of the evening, where some of the world's biggest stars stepped out in designs from legendary fashion houses only to deliver results that left audiences divided. From ambitious ideas that missed the mark to looks that defied all explanation, we break down the night's biggest missteps, ranked from simply confusing to truly astonishing. And the number one look might make you question everything you thought you saw on the red carpet. Lena Dunham's return to the Met Gala red carpet after a 7-year absence was, by any measure, a moment that drew attention. As a host committee member for the evening, expectations were naturally elevated, placing her appearance under an even sharper spotlight than usual. The look she chose, a custom blood-red Valentino gown by Alessandro Michele, carried undeniable ambition from the outset. The conceptual foundation was intriguing, suggesting a deliberate attempt to align with the evening's broader themes of fashion as expression and art-driven storytelling. On paper, it had the ingredients of a striking comeback moment, built around bold color choice and a designer known for highly narrative, symbol-rich collections. The design drew direct inspiration from Artemisia Gentileschi's Judith-slaying Holofernes, one of the Baroque period's most emotionally charged works, a painting known for its raw intensity, dramatic realism, and unflinching depiction of power and violence. Translating that level of historical and artistic weight into wearable fashion is an exceptionally difficult challenge, requiring precision in symbolism as much as in construction. In this interpretation, however, the result leaned more towards spectacle than narrative clarity. The strapless silk georgette gown, fully covered in shimmering sequins intended to evoke the visual language of blood spatter, carried a bold and provocative premise. Yet in execution, the effect felt visually saturated rather than evocative, with the intensity of the concept overwhelming the subtlety needed to transform historical reference into refined couture storytelling. The addition of a plume-heavy collar and thick crow-feather trim along the neckline, bodice, and hem culminating in a dramatic feathered train introduced multiple layers of visual weight that ultimately overwhelmed the silhouette rather than framing it. Instead of directing attention toward a central narrative, the accumulation of detail dispersed focus, creating a sense of visual competition where no single element could fully resolve itself. The accessory choices further complicated the reading. Red Valentino rock-stud sandals, once emblematic of early 2000s fashion identity, felt more nostalgic than intentional, introducing a temporal disconnect that softened the intended historical gravitas of the concept. Loud, layered, and conceptually overextended, the look attempted to communicate multiple ideas at once, but in doing so, it ultimately diluted its own message rather than defining it clearly. Under the fashion is art theme, Kylie Jenner's Met Gala appearance aimed to embody sculptural sophistication, but the result left many viewers divided. Her gown, designed by Daniel Roseberry for the iconic house of Schiaparelli, was intended as a walking artwork, a blend of fashion, illusion, and surrealist storytelling meant to blur the line between body and sculpture. However, the final presentation sparked debate over whether the concept fully translated beyond the runway. The upper portion of the dress featured a rigid, nude-toned corset, detailed with surrealist elements including a faux belly button, a recognizable Schiaparelli signature referencing the human body as a canvas. While the intention was clearly artistic and conceptual, the execution created a polarizing effect, leaving audiences questioning where innovation ends and confusion begins in high fashion's most experimental moments. In theory, the naked dress illusion is a well-established fashion technique, often used to create a bold yet elegant interplay between skin tone and fabric. In practice, however, this interpretation leaned more toward discomfort than refinement, leaving a divided impression rather than a cohesive artistic statement. Below the waist, layers of cream and ivory satin cascaded in heavy, folded volumes, forming a skirt-like structure that felt as if it were still in the process of becoming. Reportedly requiring over 11,000 hours of embroidery, the design incorporated Baroque-inspired pearls and intricate fish-scale textures, showcasing an extraordinary level of craftsmanship. Yet despite the technical mastery, the overall result felt visually dense and overwhelming, with no clear focal point to anchor the eye or elevate the look from spectacle to fully realized artistry. The styling choices added another layer of complexity to an already polarizing look. A large, antique silver necklace worn backwards appeared to be an intentional subversion of traditional placement, yet visually it read as disorienting rather than deliberate. The beauty direction offered little grounding contrast, either heavily bleached brows softened her facial definition, while the combination of a single sculpted pin curl paired with sweeping old Hollywood waves created a tension between eras that felt more constructed than effortless. Instead of reinforcing a unified vision, the hair and makeup seemed to pull in different creative directions from the gown itself. The polished retro glamour of the hairstyle stood in contrast to the dress's more experimental, deconstructed spirit, leaving the overall presentation visually fragmented. For a night dedicated to fashion as fine art, the look ultimately raises a broader question about high-concept styling. When does intentional boldness begin to tip into visual confusion? Lily Rose Depp arrived at the Met Gala leaning into a soft Chanel-inspired glam aesthetic, a fitting choice given her long-standing relationship as a house ambassador. However, within the context of a night defined by the bold fashion is art mandate, her appearance read less like a daring artistic statement and more like a restrained interpretation of elegance, polished, composed, but notably understated compared to the evening's more experimental direction. The gray silk crepe gown was, by any technical measure, an exceptional piece of craftsmanship. Reportedly requiring around 597 hours of meticulous work and featuring over 2,000 individually embroidered elements, it reflected the precision and heritage often associated with high-fashion ateliers. Yet despite its refinement and detail, the overall presentation leaned toward quiet minimalism, creating a contrast between the garment's artistry and the event's expectation for maximal, boundary-pushing expression. The dedication behind the piece was undeniable. Chanel's ateliers are legendary for this kind of meticulous craftsmanship, a tradition that traces back to Gabrielle Chanel herself. Every stitch reflected time, skill, and heritage, the kind of detail that defines true haute couture. But in fashion, labor alone is never the final measure of impact. On the grand stone steps of the Metropolitan Museum, the gown's muted silvery tone faded into the surrounding scene, losing the visual authority needed to anchor a moment of such scale. The styling choices further complicated the effect. Lily Rose paired the look with pale blue cap-toe slingbacks, a delicate pastel that introduced an unexpected break in the palette rather than a seamless extension of it. Instead of elevating the ensemble, the contrast softened its presence even more, creating a visual fragmentation that dulled the overall narrative. In an environment built on bold expression and artistic risk, the look ultimately raised a quiet but compelling question: when does refinement become restraint that blends in too easily? The color contrast subtly drew attention away from the gown's silhouette at the very moment when visual cohesion mattered most. In a setting where fashion as art encourages boldness, experimentation, and transformation, the overall styling felt noticeably restrained. Every element was carefully constructed and technically sound, yet the final impression leaned towards safe elegance rather than memorable innovation. At the Met Gala, where even the most storied houses are challenged to reinterpret their legacy, execution alone is not always enough to leave a lasting mark. In that context, the look ultimately reads as polished but understated, highlighting the fine line between refined simplicity and an absence of impact. Classical antiquity has long stood as one of fashion's most enduring sources of inspiration, from Madame Grey's iconic pleated column dresses of the 1930s to Versace's flowing Grecian silhouettes in the Club 1990. So when Suki Waterhouse appeared at the Met Gala in a custom peach-pink Michael Kors gown designed to evoke the draped stone forms of ancient Greek sculpture, the reference itself was both familiar and historically grounded. However, the challenge was never the concept, but the translation of that concept into a visually commanding presence. Instead of feeling like sculptural drapery carved into motion, the gown leaned toward softness and restraint, with a muted tone that reduced its visual impact under the event's bright lights and grand architectural setting. Rather than echoing the strength and permanence of classical stonework, the result felt more delicate and understated, blurring the intended narrative of power and form. The silhouette ultimately lacked the structural presence required to fully support such a conceptually rich reference. A plunging V neckline extending toward the midriff, while dramatic in theory, has become so familiar on the red carpet that it no longer carries the weight of a bold artistic statement. In this context, it read less as an innovative reinterpretation and more as a recognizable template that failed to elevate the overall design. The accessories, which appeared intended to reinforce the classical inspiration, instead pushed the styling into uncertain territory. Rather than deepening the couture narrative, they introduced a level of literal interpretation that shifted the look away from refined homage and closer toward theatrical styling. The result blurred the line between high-fashion interpretation and costume-like expression, weakening the cohesion of an otherwise ambitious concept. A diamond leaf circlet, a matching cuff, and oversized chunky rings combined to create a visual language that felt less like refined couture styling and more like an overlayered interpretation of a mythological archetype. Each piece, taken individually, had the potential to contribute to a cohesive narrative of classical inspiration. However, when worn together, they competed for attention, creating a sense of visual overload rather than balance or elevation. Even the beauty direction, with soft, flushed cheeks and subtly shimmering lids, leaned toward restraint at a moment that called for stronger editorial contrast. In the context of a theme as expansive as fashion is art, which invites transformation, experimentation, and risk, the overall presentation remained firmly within safe territory. The final impression was polished and pleasant, but ultimately predictable, a look that hinted at ambition without fully committing to the theatrical scale the occasion encourages. There is a long tradition of white gowns defining memorable Met Gala moments through pure restraint and precise construction. Karlie Kloss's custom Dior look, designed under Maria Grazia Chiuri and rooted in the house's legacy dating back to Christian Dior's 1947 new look, arrived with clear conceptual potential. A blank white canvas aligned with the night's fashion is art theme. However, while the idea was strong, the execution didn't fully carry its impact. Instead of a striking reinterpretation of simplicity, the gown leaned more toward understated than transformative, leaving its artistic message present in theory but less powerful in practice. But alignment in theory and impact in practice are two very different things. What appeared on the steps of the Metropolitan Museum felt less like a bold artistic statement and more like an exercise in restraint. Surrounded by highly theatrical, boundary-pushing creations, the look struggled to command attention and instead receded into the visual background. The gown's most distinctive feature, a structured, bulbous lower silhouette intended to read as sculptural, ultimately became its most divisive element. Rather than delivering controlled drama and clear couture intention, the exaggerated shape felt visually uncertain, disrupting proportion without offering a strong sense of resolution or impact. It is a difficult balance to strike volume without heaviness, boldness without confusion. In this case, the equilibrium leaned in the wrong direction. The gown's sculptural intent lost clarity in execution, leaving the overall impression slightly uncertain rather than sharply defined. Her beauty choices did little to shift that narrative. A sleek chignon accented with a single purple orchid and a soft mauve lip were elegant in isolation, but too restrained for an evening built on artistic risk and transformation. The result was polished and controlled, yet lacking the visual impact needed to resonate in such a high-stakes creative setting. Refined, but not truly unforgettable. Few guests at the Met Gala generate as much discussion as Kim Kardashian, and her interpretation of the fashion as art theme was no exception. In collaboration with British pop artist Alan Jones and design duo Whittaker Malum, she arrived in a vivid tangerine fiberglass breastplate that immediately sparked divided reactions. The intention was unmistakable: to push fashion into the realm of literal sculpture, where the body itself becomes the canvas. Conceptually, the idea aligns closely with what a theme like fashion is. Art encourages transformation, provocation, and the blurring of boundaries between garment and artwork. However, while the ambition was clear, the final impression proved more complicated, sitting in that uneasy space where conceptual boldness collides with public interpretation. But there is a meaningful difference between wearable sculpture and a rigid prop attached to a human form. The fiberglass breastplate, reportedly finished in an auto body shop, never fully shed its industrial associations. Instead of feeling fluid or integrated with the body, it came across as stiff and mechanical, qualities that often separate true couture craftsmanship from pure spectacle. While the anatomical detailing echoed the recognizable visual language of Alan Jones, its impact was diluted within the broader context of the evening, where similar body-referencing motifs appeared across multiple looks. As a result, Kardashian's interpretation felt less like a breakthrough statement and more like one variation within a wider, already familiar conversation happening on the red carpet. The remaining elements struggled to create cohesion. An open front leather skirt, hand-painted in sunset-inspired tones, made a clear attempt to soften the rigid upper structure, but it never fully bridged the gap between the industrial breastplate and the more fluid, expressive lower half. Instead of unifying the silhouette, it highlighted the tension between competing ideas of form and material. A burnt orange cape draped from the hips added yet another visual layer, amplifying complexity rather than resolving it. What might have become a striking sculptural statement ultimately dissolved into fragmentation, an example of how quickly a high-concept design can tip from bold experimentation into a visually overworked composition. Sarah Pigeon has built her public image around a quietly confident, understated elegance, a refined minimalism often compared to the effortless 1990s aesthetic associated with Carolyn Bessette Kennedy, one of fashion's most enduring style references. That established identity made her Met Gala appearance all the more surprising. Instead of evolving her signature restraint into something elevated and thematic for the night, she opted for a sharp and unexpected departure. However, the change in direction felt less like a bold reinvention and more like a stylistic mismatch with the event's fashion as art energy, and ultimately, the gamble did not fully land in terms of impact or cohesion. Her chosen look, a vibrant chartreuse matching set aimed for a sculptural interpretation of the fashion, is art dress code. The collaboration with Jonathan Anderson carried real promise, given his reputation for conceptually driven, intelligent design that often pushes familiar silhouettes into new territory. However, the execution did not fully match the ambition. The centerpiece, a strapless, bow-shaped, twisted bandeau top, appeared intended as an exploration of the body as a sculptural subject, aligning with the exhibition's broader artistic themes. Instead, the construction felt visually unresolved, as though the concept had not fully matured into a cohesive final form, leaving the overall impression more experimental than refined. The floor-length column skirt, replacing the original runway leggings in an attempt to introduce more elegance, ultimately compounded the imbalance rather than resolving it. Its silhouette lacked the structural presence needed to ground the heavier matte satin of the top, leaving the proportions feeling visually uncertain and slightly disconnected. The styling choices offered little counterbalance. Soft, loosely undone waves and barely, their natural makeup effortless in other contexts felt too casual for an event centered on conceptual risk and artistic expression. The final result was a look suspended between two directions, never fully committing to either restraint or experimentation, and therefore losing clarity in its overall message. Few performers working today arrive at the Met Gala carrying quite the same weight of expectation as Doja Cat. Her past appearances have shown a rare willingness to commit fully to theatrical transformation, most notably her 2023 look, where she was painted head to toe in red and covered in over 30,000 Swarovski crystals to resemble a striking anatomical figure. That level of fearless, fully embodied performance set an exceptionally high bar for anything that followed. Her 2025 appearance, by comparison, felt like a noticeable step back. Designed by Anthony Vaccarello for Saint Laurent, the look carried the expectation of similar conceptual intensity, but struggled to recapture the same level of commitment and impact that defined her most memorable Met Gala moments. The semi-sheer, nude-draped gown was built on an intriguing concept: silicone and latex, engineered to replicate the fluid, weightless qualities of ancient Greek marble drapery. It was exactly the kind of material experimentation and conceptual design that the fashion as art theme is meant to encourage. On paper, the idea was strong, merging classical reference with modern fabrication in a way that suggested real innovation. However, the execution didn't fully realize that promise. The nude-toned palette, while clearly intentional, ultimately worked against the clarity of the silhouette. Combined with long sleeves and a high thigh slit, the design folded visually into itself, creating a monochromatic effect that softened its sculptural intent. Rather than reading as sharply defined and architectural, the look dissolved into a blur of tone and texture, weakening the crisp impact the concept seemed to aim for. Layering a matching latex robe over the gown, anchored by oversized gold hardware, introduced additional visual weight that further obscured the silhouette rather than clarifying it. Instead of sharpening the concept, the added elements created more visual density, softening the overall impact and diluting the original sculptural intent. Her beauty choices reinforced this effect rather than counterbalancing it. A blonde full-lace wig paired with beige-toned makeup, closely matched to the gown's palette, reduced contrast and dimensionality across the entire look. The result felt visually muted rather than ethereal or transformative. For an artist known for bold reinvention, the overall presentation came across as unexpectedly restrained, with less of the dramatic commitment that has defined her most memorable appearances.